Much. Mr. Trump is fighting charges that he is sexist by threatening a lawsuit against the New York Times for libel. In the meantime, a pro-Clinton super PAC is capitalizing on Trump's woes with women in a new ad.
You know, you could see there was blood coming out of her eyes, blood coming out of her wherever. Does she have a good body? No. Does she have a fat ass? Absolutely. You like girls that are 5'1", they come up to you know where?
If Ivanka weren't my daughter, perhaps I'd be dating her.
I view a person who's flat-chested is very hard to be a 10.
And you can tell them to go themselves.
Donald Trump already fighting back, tweeting this morning, quote, "Amazing that crooked Hillary can do a hit on me concerning women when her husband was the worst abuser of women in U.S. political history." With me now, CNN political commentator and op-ed columnist for the New York Times, Ross Douthat, senior policy analyst for the Independent Women's Forum, Hadley Heath Manning, and CNN media analyst Bill Carter. Welcome to all of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Hadley, how should Donald Trump respond to those ads?
I'll tell you how he should respond, and then I'll tell you how I think he will respond. I think Trump needs to focus on an economic agenda that's going to have broad appeal, especially with women. Women do a lot of household budgeting. They know that their budgets are stretched in terms of health care expenses, education. He needs to meet some of these conversation points from the Clinton campaign about equal pay and paid leave head on. But instead, I'm afraid what we're going to see in this campaign cycle is more negative ads. Of course, just as the Clinton camp can take some of Trump's own words and use them against him, there also can be the same play against the Clinton campaign. I'm afraid that Trump's response is going to be more negative ads against Secretary Clinton. Although we don't like negative ads, they're very effective.
Yes, that's true. A lot of analysts do say that. Ross, some suggest that Trump should respond by giving interviews to news stations, not through negative ads. It's cheaper, and of course it's worked for him in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the lessons of this cycle, at least, has been the relative ineffectiveness of negative ads, including negative ads against Donald Trump in the Republican primary. And I think Trump's strategy all along has been to essentially dominate the free media landscape. And his perspective is, that he can basically get the same amount of coverage that an ad gets just by going on TV, or in this case, just by tweeting. I think that there's something to that. I think that it's pretty clear that Trump's response to being accused of sexism will be to attack Hillary Clinton for enabling her husband's history of misbehavior with women. And I think he can get that message out fairly effectively, whether he does it through Twitter, television, or any other medium. The question is, I'm very doubtful that that message will be enough to actually win him the election, but that does seem to be the message that he's running with, and I don't think the media will be shy about covering it.
No, you're right about that. So, Bill, Trump is threatening to sue the New York Times, but only one of the 9 women quoted in that article says she was misrepresented. Trump's former executive, Barbara Rez, did an interview on CNN. She says the article was accurate and that Trump is an angry man. Listen.
He would criticize, for as long as I know him, he always had comments on people's appearances and, primarily weight, male and female. I ran into him at a funeral and he was kind of nasty to me. But I would say good luck with life, Donald, but I don't think that you're, should president.
Still, Bill, did the New York Times only create sympathy for Donald Trump?
Well, it gave him the opportunity to attack, which is what he wants to do. That's his general mode, is to come at any story that is any way critical by attacking back instead of answering the actual story. And, there was this woman who says she was misrepresented in the tone of the story, not really misquoted. But the idea that he would sue is kind of laughable. The guy has tried to sue, threatened to sue everybody. He never goes through with that. I don't think anybody's taking that seriously. But I do think when you do any piece on him, you have to dot your I's very carefully, because any opportunity that he has to question that, he's going to throw that back, and attacking the media is very, very effective for him.
Absolutely. One effect that Donald Trump's complaints about that New York Times article has had, Ross, it's become what? The most read story? I don't know. The most read story. Yeah.
I'm very pleased with that statistic. So.
You are?
Should I not be pleased that my newspaper stories are being read all around the world? I think I should be.
You are a loyal employee. I want to talk.
I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but in fact, I'm being perfectly sincere. I think it was a story that accurately captured what we know about Trump and his relationships to women, and I think it deserves a wide readership. I do think that there was not a sort of smoking gun in the piece on the scale of, say, again, the kind of Paula Jones, Juanita Broderick stories that Trump is going to bring up about Bill Clinton. But as a portrait of Trump as he's been and as he's been with women, I thought it was a very good piece and deserves a wide readership. Yes, I'll leave it there.
All right, interesting. I want to turn the conversation to John Kasich for just a minute. You heard Phil Mattingly's report, right, Hadley? He said he won't endorse Trump at this time. Trump needs Ohio. John Kasich, maybe he'll think about it if Trump softens his tone, but is that likely to happen?
I don't think it's likely to happen, and more importantly, this is the landscape that Trump has created. He's created a win-win for himself. It doesn't matter if it's the New York Times or John Kasich, but if Kasich comes out in support of Trump, that's a win for Trump. If he comes out and opposes Trump, that's a win for Trump, because then Mr. Trump will say, look at another establishment Republican who's opposing me, just in the same way that he's responded to this New York Times article by saying, look at how this mainstream media has a liberal bias and they're attacking me. He's calling it a hit piece. So that's the way he responds to anyone who sides with him or against him. He tries to make it into a win-win, and I think he's been pretty successful at that.
Although I will say, Bill, Kasich, there are reports out there that Mr. Trump is going to meet with Henry Kissinger maybe tomorrow and talk about foreign policy. So that's something else for newspapers like the New York Times to write about, and then it can turn its attention to serious issues, right?
I guess, but I also think anytime he deals with substance, it tends to expose the fact that he doesn't really know that much about foreign policy. So it's always a risk for him, and just meeting with Kissinger doesn't really accomplish anything. I think one of the most interesting things from Kasich was that he questioned whether his wife and daughters would back him if he endorsed Trump, because he feels like that, the women issue even hits in his own family.
Right.
Well, the women issue is a very real issue. I mean, again, at the risk of defending my paper too far, that piece captured an essential part of why Donald Trump is going to have a difficult time being elected president. And it went to the heart of questions not about sort of his capabilities to run foreign policy, though those obviously matter a great deal, but about his basic fitness to hold the most prestigious office in our government. So I don't think, again, the fact that people are talking about these stories and that Trump can blame it on the liberal media, maybe it's a win-win for him. But if millions of people are reading that story, I'm not sure that that's what gets Trump the extra 5 to 10% of the vote that he needs to beat Hillary Clinton. It might be quite the reverse.
So Hadley, if Donald Trump wants to change,
either.
Right. Well, if Donald Trump wants to change the subject and wants to talk about his meeting with Henry Kissinger and talk about his ideas for foreign policy, but everybody's concentrating on his problems with women, how can he turn the tide?
Well, he's certainly a very talented messenger, a very talented marketer. He does have a lot of media exposure. He does have the opportunity to change the conversation. He brags about how he goes directly to the people, bypassing the media and talking to them through social media, means such as Twitter. He can change the subject if he wants to. I don't know that Mr. Trump wants to have a substantive policy discussion. He wants to stay on the talking points about his personality, about how he presents himself as a person of strength, as a leader of strength, rather than getting into the details, because I agree that's where he appears weak.
Okay, I'm just getting word that one of Trump's attorneys is now calling for a retraction. Is that right? I'm talking to my Michelle, my EP. Okay, so Bill, I'll pose that question to you. One of Mr. Trump's attorneys is calling for a retraction from the New York Times. Think he'll get one?
No, I think calling for a retraction, okay. They're not even printing a correction, because the quotes they're saying are accurate. And, what she's complaining about is the characterization of it. And, I don't know how you can retract that. Clarify that. I mean, they're not going to apologize or retract. I would be really surprised.
Well, how do you expect the New York Times might react, Ross?
I agree with Bill. I think that, as far as I can tell, the complaint is that one of the women, the lead anecdote in the story, said her quotes were accurate, but it made her seem, I guess, more hostile to Trump than she actually was. So the stories were real, and the story was about her when they first met, taking her into a room and having her try on a bathing suit and so on. but she wanted to make it clear that she had had a good time overall with Trump and still really liked him, which is, a valid issue to raise, but does not rise to the level of printing a retraction, because the story is accurate and the quotes are accurate. And again, it's a story made up of many overlapping voices over a long period of time, and the fact that one of the women quoted still likes Donald Trump doesn't really undercut the thrust of the piece.
All right, I have to leave it there. Ross Douthat, Hadley Heath Manning.
Might have been the wrong way of putting it. But you take my meaning.
Thanks, Ross. And thanks to you, Hadley Heath Manning and Bill Carter.